So this is not the paper that I had envisaged delivering ahead of my Trentine adventure. Eleanor and Tom were supplied with quite a different abstract, aha, it works, than the one which has made its way into your inboxes. The focus there was on exploring Herodotus's techniques in signposting, some of his metatextual strategies and narratorial interventions designed to facilitate readerly comprehension of his innovative project. For now, I deposit that talk in my metaphorical... This is very frustrating. Oh.
Okay.
Oh, in my metaphorical filing cabinet that barely made its way onto your screens, hopeful that it may see the light of day in the not too distant future. The nature of my presentation this evening has changed, however, necessarily so, perhaps, in the light of the many conversations that I've been so privileged to partake in during the last nearly 2 weeks. Therefore, in the spirit of open exchange of ideas, which I believe to be central to the Herodotus Helpline, in what follows, I delve a little deeper into exploring what has been a most stimulating and intellectually inspiring visit here in this valid Tyrolean city. My approach will be somewhat thematic, a collection, and much has been said these days on Herodotus the author's influential role in assembling a collection of logoi, which ultimately represents only a fraction of the innumerable logoi that might have been included in his work. A collection of different topics and lines of inquiry that have animated discussions here at Trento over the last week and a half. While only a snapshot of the many ideas exchanged, I hope that nevertheless the talk captures something of the rich and varied interactions that I've been privy to during my time in Trento. First, the biographical impulse. That is to say, the assumptions made concerning Herodotus, the man behind the histories. Readers have long appreciated the prominent authorial presence in the histories, not to mention the significant number of interventions made by the historian. Statements of method, comments on others' accounts, opinions on sometimes controversial matters, to name but a few. Indeed, Caroline de Would's 1987 Arethusa article traced more than 1,000 of such narratorial interventions across the histories. As a note, all items of bibliography that I mentioned will be listed at the end of this PowerPoint presentation. Notwithstanding the narrator's heightened presence on the surface of the text, it's imperative that we distinguish, as Liz Irwin would rightly remind me in conversation, between the man from Halicarnassus and the literary construct that is the histories Herodotus of Halicarnassus, the inquirer. Yet we must too acknowledge that the edges are not always sharp, the colours not quite monochromatic. For unless we endorse the conclusions reached by Detlev Fehling in his 1971 monograph, Die Quellen and Gaben bei Herodotus fabricating his sources in an attempt to create a kind of pseudo-historiographical text, we must more or less accept that Herodotus the man did indeed conduct a series of travels across many areas of the Mediterranean, and that he interrogated a variety of sources in different contexts, from individual informants to priestly authorities to epigraphic data and beyond. As discussions with students this last week or so have illustrated, acknowledging the basic fact of Herodotus's travels, and for this topic, I recommend Greta Hall's chapter in the Jessica Priestley Vasilikizali volume on the reception of Herodotus, accepting that the histories are in some measure a reification of Herodotus's actual travels hardly necessitates reading individual travel statements as diaristic reportage of the itinerant historian's precise movements across space and time. The case of Herodotus interviewing the priests of Amen at Thebes a scene I will return to a little later, or even his purported voyage to Tyre and Thassos in order to determine the Egyptian origins of the god Heracles, are just two such cases wherein the relationship between Herodotus's real Egyptological, in these instances, inquiries, versus Book Two's carefully constructed presentation of Herodotean travel and inquiry is, to put it mildly, enigmatic. This is, I think, difficult work. No easy answers when it comes to Herodotus, the man behind the histories. Clearly, this point holds no less true for the authors of other ancient historiographical texts, although the issues that manifest are not alike. Thucydides, the exiled general, is evidently cut from a different cloth than the patchwork fabric that is Herodotus's histories. Still, plenty of fruitful discussion to be had about the very real challenges associated with travel in the 5th century BCE. The intellectual leap required to construct such a novel and ambitious historical narrative, which is the product of a non-omniscient narrator, and the limited possibilities for presenting oneself autobiographically at a time long before such a literary mode had been established. So to say nothing too of the related, rather vexed questions of how Herodotus's work was assembled, its initial distribution, and the format of its publication. I declare here with an uncharacteristic level of assuredness that we can safely dismiss any thought of Herodotus 424 BCE, the histories out now. Enough then of what I term the biographical impulse. Next, methodologies. Yes, lots to say on this aspect too, though not quite in the way that one might suppose. For sure, there have been some nods in our discussions to the narrator's overt methodological statements and assertions. For example, Herodotus's famous declaration at 2991 concerning the use of his own opsis, gnome, historiae, an approach that appears to carry across to other parts of the histories. But ideas on Herodotean historiographical praxis cannot be separated from a whole suite of related concerns, from the use of analogy, for which see Corcella, 1984, to Herodotus's historical epistemology, which is inextricably bound up with the cultural, social, religious mores of his day. So in this sense, an unceasing alertness to the question of Herodotus's methodological approach, whatever the particular focus. This leads me nicely to the topic of collecting. From Herodotus's penchant for describing grand monuments and other significant objects, to his preservation of more than 20 inscriptions, lapidary markers whose historical credentials have not inspired much confidence amongst some of his readers. The historian is indubitably in the business of not only conducting inquiries, but also, as author of the histories, curating a diverse collection of sources that can be found dispersed across the work, which last week Professor Giangulio well referred to as a palimpsest of pre-existing stories and traditions. We may wish to see the overall presentation of such materials as an accurate record of the particular sources of information available to and utilized by the author, or we may, more skeptically, question the foundations of some, many, all of such references. Irrespective of how much faith we might place in the historical validity of Herodotus's dispersed collection of sources, it's clear enough that this collection contributes meaningfully towards his considered articulation of the itinerant inquirer who crafts a highly ambitious historiographical account in prose format, narrative persona, that is, after all, the Herodotean gestalt. It is in this sense that we undertook to try and make sense of, amongst other examples, that improbable triptych of Cadmeian grammata deposited at the Theban temple of Ismenian Apollo, embedded in an excursus that invites a range of perspectives and approaches. that touch on Herodotus's appeal to certain types of evidence and his knowledge of the linguistic roots of the Greek alphabet. And I should remark too on his specific reference to Ionic characters, thereby diminishing the role of other epichoric alphabets in the early formation and diffusion of the Greek alphabet. One could, I confess, also raise the spectre of Hecataeus, whom we know, along with Anaximander and Dionysius of Miletus, to have presented the Egyptian Danaus as responsible for conveying writing to Greece. More to be said on Hecataeus than Milesian Logopoios presently. That's all I will say for now on the topic of collecting, though I fancy that there is much more to be said about Herodotus's curatorial strategies. Oracles. As you might expect, our discussions often included references to oracular texts and oracle stories. Observing Herodotus's predilection for reporting especially Delphic oracles, we considered various examples in which Herodotus not only cites some particular oracular text, there are more than 60 of these in the histories, but where he's equally interested in displaying the processes surrounding oracular interpretation. These discussions on oracles might well have taken in such famous cases of those of Themistocles and the so-called wooden wall oracle, a crucial episode before the Greeks' victory at Salamis, or indeed the case of the pious Egyptian pharaoh Mycerinus, who responds to an oracle from Buto that prophesies his death within 7 years. And he responds, by living fully, both by day and by night, hence extending his life at least another 6 years. As it is, ideas centered specially on the figure of Croesus, that great imperialist whose kingdom, as we learn in Book 1, is destroyed by the Persian Cyrus. One of many such cases, then, in support of Herodotus's famous dictum on great cities becoming small and formerly small cities becoming great. After exploring certain key strands of the Logos, not least Gyges killing Candaules and thus setting in train Croesus's allotted defenestration, focus eventually turned to Herodotus's famous prose oracle at 191, briefly referred to in the Q&A here last week. That here carrying a different valence than has heretofore been the case. In this chapter, the god Apollo relays his kind disposition towards devout Croesus, his, that is Apollo's, inability to deflect the Moirai, though he did, somewhat eccentrically, secure a further 3 years of dynastic prosperity on behalf of Croesus, as well as Croesus's own culpability, his flawed communicative procedures with the Delphic oracle, interpretations too hasty, lack of follow-up. Ideas on this passage were striking, to say the least. Marco Ferrario, well known to Helpline audiences from his paper delivered in late 2021 on Herodotus's account of King Darius I at Chorasmia, now published in the 2022 issue of Orbis Terrarum, brilliantly remarked on a potentially intriguing parallel a few chapters earlier than this in the meeting between Cyrus and Croesus, where Cyrus experiences pity for the fallen Lydian king, with that of Achilles and Priam near the climax of the Iliad, a thought-provoking point of comparison that, as far as I know, has not previously been observed in the scholarship. Ad-libbing just a little bit here, we proceeded to examine the implications of the points of similarity and difference between these two scenes. The former scene features 2 non-Greeks, although, as well pointed out by PhD candidate Diego Bordoni, the Lydian king Croesus was undoubtedly a Philhellene who made significant dedications at Delphi and established a strategic alliance with the Spartans. In the latter scene, the model is Greek Achilles, pitying non-Greek Priam. What's more, Croesus could be seen as a kind of in-between king, perhaps also an epithet for which to view Achilles in the Iliad. Ideas then continue to build on the potential epic resonances of chapter 91, Diego Bordoni, for instance, drew attention to the phrase in bold here on the screen, doloi gunaikeioi, in bold, which invites readers to contemplate other examples of guileful women in Greek literature, such as the Odyssey's Penelope and her weaving and unweaving of a pool. The trick there, of course, designed to resist the transition of monarchic power away from Polydlas Odysseus. The poetic form loxias, used 3 times in 191 and only once elsewhere in the Histories, 4163, again an oracular context, also betokens a heightened register. Though the frequent use of this epithet in lyric poetry, Greek tragedy, might encourage us to widen and further still our search for the poetic contexts that may underlie some aspects of this passage. Metanarrative. If there's one thing that tied a great many of our debates, it would be a certain attentiveness to the metanarrative dimension. Naturally, it would be invidious for audiences to give primacy to sub or metatextual readings at every turn, for Herodotus commits himself at the very outset to the task of preserving the great and marvelous deeds of all manner of peoples. What he writes has purchase, it matters. For example, the historian's statement that the Thessalians lost all allied support at the time of Xerxes' crossing of the Hellespont, and therefore with goodwill they fought on behalf of the Persians. Or indeed, his adjudicative remarks on the Corinthians' contribution during the Battle of Salamis. While the Athenians assert that the Corinthians fled, many other Greeks attest to their prominent position in the naval battle. In this instance, of course, Herodotus inclines one to side with the majority view. The rest of Hellas bears them witness, as we can see on the screen. Albeit, we note, his work preserves the insalubrious Athenian variant tradition. His inclusion of this unflattering Athenian account is by no means a necessity. While Herodotus has a tendency to report multiple accounts, encouraging readers to weigh in on matters, so too he elsewhere pronounces his preferred version on a topic. So here, for instance, concerning the logoi circulating about Cyrus's life, or indeed his not always justified decision to withhold certain information. And here I give us 2 examples on the screen where Herodotus announces he won't tell his readers something. Notwithstanding this salient point about what we might term Herodotus's responsibilities as historical narrator, the possibility of a meta-narrative dimension is clearly one that can stimulate exciting possibilities. To focus on just one such case in point, the meeting between Herodotus and the priests of Ammon at Thebes, briefly mentioned earlier. Here, Herodotus juxtaposes his own behavior as tourist inquirer with his prose predecessor Hecateus, more than once fashioned logopoios, who genealogizes in the company of the Theban priests, counting his family line back 16 generations to a divine forefather. The priests, it turns out, are not quite persuaded. They proceed to show Hecateus, just as they did for Herodotus, 345 wooden statues, each of which denote a priest who had a statue for himself erected. So, as Herodotus tells us, they do not accept Hecateus's genealogy, in which a man so near in time is descended from a god. Well, where to begin? Discussions centered not least on Herodotus's emphasis on Hecatean genealogizing, a point of departure from Herodotean historiae, on Herodotus's humble brag about desisting from tracing his own lineage, another fussy point of detail, by no means bound for inclusion in the narrative, and on the contrasting methods, Hecateus's genealogical methodology versus the priest's demonstration with material proof, the wooden statues, and observe here the less than even presentation of their respective approaches, how Herodotus dedicates so much of this narrative to the priest's argumentation, while saying remarkably little about Hecataeus' approach. Did he read from a pre-prepared genealogical text? Was he supported by a translator? Whom was the god from which Hecataeus and his ancestors descended? Yet, we pondered, perhaps even all these considerations remain only really at the surface. Do the currents run much deeper? For instance, when prodded to consider further the specific effect of Herodotus's reference to Hecataeus, the first time he's mentioned by Herodotus in the Histories, though surely not the first time that audiences and readers can detect his presence in the work. Lucavalle Salazar pondered whether the Logos was in fact about Hecataeus very much at all. Given Herodotus's repeated emphasis elsewhere on Egypt's vast history and the Egyptians' adeptness for commemoration of the past, Hecataeus might in fact function as a cipher for the Greeks and their somewhat feeble attempts to record the past. A germane line of inquiry I accede, given Herodotus's more overt polemics against Hellenic thinking at different points in Book 2 and beyond. It would be easy to expand further on this passage and on other Herodotean meta-narratives. For instance, if I had more time, I would adduce Herodotus's rather terse account of the staging of Phrynichus's capture of Miletus at 621, which ironically commits to memory a drama that the Athenians had sought to censor to prevent the play from wheedling its way into the memories of the uninitiated. Perhaps a topic for the Q&A. But for now, I must march on. Book 2. Not Rome, in fact. All roads appear to lead to Herodotus's so-called Aegyptios Logos. Time and again, our discussions returned to the history's monumental account concerning the geography, culture, and history of Egypt. From his critique of the inadequate Greek attempts to explain the Nile inundation, to his narrative on Proteus's interview with and dismissal of dishonourable Paris, it was scarcely possible to conduct any of our inquiries without directing at least a certain level of attention towards the book that some of Herodotus's more influential readers have, curiously enough, regarded as being somewhat distinct from the rest of his project. Helpline audiences, however, have already seen recently from Alexander Schutzer's presentation earlier this year how Book 2 is carefully positioned ahead of and in dialogue with Book 3's Cambyses Logos. And we can surely widen the scope further still in order to appreciate ever more fully the connections and relationship between Book 2 and other parts of the Histories, comparing the inquiring methods of the different groups of priests at Thebes, Heliopolis, and Memphis against other Herodotean inquirers, a la Christ 1994, and investigating the commemorative activities of different Egyptian kings versus other Herodotean autocrats strikes me as just two potentially fruitful avenues for new research, which could prove novel insights into some of the structural and thematic importance of Book 2 in the Histories more broadly. Next, wonder. A leitmotif of Herodotus's work, of course, for which see Munson 2001. Specifically in this case, however, I refer to my own repeated sense of bibliographic-induced thauma as I attempted to distill some of what I consider to be the most important elements of Herodotus's historical narration into my scheduled programme of talks. My admiration extended to scholars such as fellow helpliner Rosaria Munson, author of 2 monographs, a commentary together with Carolyn DeWald, and myriad articles on Herodotus, who has also edited 2 volumes on Herodotus for Oxford Readings in Classical Studies. The task of assembling a collection of readings that reflects the scholarly landscape on an author who has generated as much scholarship as Herodotus is truly mind-blowing. In a similar vein, I found myself in awe of Christopher Barron, editor of a recent 3-volume encyclopedia on Herodotus, which incorporates a huge array of entries, a significant number of these authored by Barron himself, covering topics as diverse as Sardinia, crocodiles, death. But wonder too, as a product of the thoughtful and engaged responses shown by so many of the students I've been working with here. Having introduced a well-known testimonium on porphyry in Eusebius, brilliantly discussed by John Dillery in his 2018 article, Making Logoi, in which porphyry appears to have claimed that Herodotus essentially plagiarized Hecataeus' accounts on the phoenix bird, hippopotamuses, and the hunting of crocodiles, I was struck by the number of winces and shudders in the room. In one way, no doubt, such reactions stem from the discomfort we experience in contemplating Herodotus's dishonest reduplication of Hecataeus' words, effectively passing off an important predecessor's ideas as his own. Though I ask parenthetically, is it credible that Herodotus would have been able to pass off the words of such an important predecessor as his own? Or is it the case that we've overestimated the status of Hecataeus, partly led by some of the other ancient testimonia, which elevate him to the status of proto or even first historian? Or in another way, perhaps Herodotus's initial audiences were not at all troubled by the near reduplication of another author's ideas. For sure, copyright laws were not in vogue in classical Greece. But the shudders perhaps also reflected a certain uneasiness with the implications of Porphyry's claim, which imagines a rather bookish Herodotus carefully poring over his text of Hecataeus, decanting particular lines which are then reinserted into their new Herodotean landscape. Bookish Herodotus will feel quite improbable to many of us, an absurdity even. Though some of you might not be surprised to hear me remind us of the Helen Logos, where yes, indeed, bookish Herodotus quotes a specific passage from the Iliad as part of his showpiece on the true whereabouts of Helen and Homer's awareness of that true account. To all this, I should add, while the complex and far from monological reception of Herodotus in antiquity provides several unflattering, less than kind traditions about the Halicarnassian, Herodotus the plagiarist is not one that agglomerates. For the sake of fullness, I note here the 2nd century Christian theologian Clement of Alexandria and his Parmenidean-derived charge in a lengthy list of apparently plagiaristic activities in Greek literature that the Philadelphic sentiments expressed by Interfernes' wife are lifted from Sophocles' Antigone, a subject that, as many of you will know, has been debate in the scholarship. And as an aside, Clement also observes in the same chapter that Aristophanes lifted from Herodotus the sentiment expressed by the Pythia towards Glaucus, the Spartan, namely that in the case of the god, to say and to do are equivalent. Last, but by no means least, friendships. A key word most assuredly for my imagined written-up version of this talk. As I'm sure is manifest from these not purely whimsical, I hope, reflections, open, engaged, and generous conversation has been at the heart of my time here in Trento. I've learnt much from scholars whose expertise spreads to as diverse topics as that of preparing a new critical edition of the Palatine anthology, Chiara Pesaresi, to thematic readings of Plutarch's Life of Pompey, Francesca Cao, to epigraphic study of border communities in Roman Italy and the provinces of the empire, Luca Veroni. And those learnings were far from being confined to the seminar room. Café al Banco led to some stimulating discussions on topics ranging from the fragment of an old Persian inscription discovered during the Fanagarea excavation in 2016, which has excited a lot of scholarly debate in recent years, to the thematic connections between Euripides' Alcestis and the black comedy drama Afterlife. I confess too that there was plenty said about British trains, a drain on one's wallet, and I hasten to add, often less than reliable. CF2, to use that academic shorthand, the enlightening conversations that occurred at Tavola, a delightful change from the usual business of lunch al desco. So, fearing that this kind of reflective, somewhat apological talk does not invite the kind of post-paper discussions that have been the hallmark of this collective endeavour since its formation in April 2020, a time that evokes, at least for me, LP Hartley's much repeated aphorism, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." I entreat you all to lead forth with your questions, comments, observations. In doing so, we will uphold the syllogic identity of the Herodotus Helpline, which is to evoke the European Space Agency's JUICE probe currently hurtling its way to Jupiter's moons, propelled by Herodotus's boundless intellectual curiosity. Thank you.